So when it comes to the so-called transatlantic slave trade and the notion of millions of Africans being brought from Africa to North and South America, we have to examine the events that were taking place during the time of this so-called transatlantic slave trade. So we know that the Moors ruled all of Europe. And in this painting, you can see that the Moors were fighting what is classified as the wild men of Europe. So we can look at the events that were taking place during the so-called transatlantic slave trade, such as the many wars that were taking place between the Moors and the so-called wild men. Now, after the white races had overcome the Moors, we are told that the Moors went back to Africa because the white races of Europe supposedly expelled the Moors from Europe, and we're told that the majority of these Moors went back to Africa. Now, you have to keep in mind a few things. White people of Europe were illiterate peasants with no last names, and they had no ships. The Moors had a fleet of ships, and their ships were taken by white people and used to transport all of the Moors out of Europe. Some of the Moors were able to escape in some of their ships, and they went to Africa. However, the majority of the Moors that were unable to escape were gathered by the white races, put into ships, and transported to North and South America, which was only a 10-day boat ride away from Europe. So we're told that white people of France and Spain are largely responsible for the transatlantic slave trade. And if we look at the same white people of France and Spain are the ones responsible for expelling the Moors from Europe. So did white people of France and Spain really travel all the way to Africa to buy African slaves at the same time they were expelling the Moors from Europe? Keep in mind that the journey from Europe to Africa and back would take 2 months. Each way is a 30-day boat ride. So do you think that they traveled for 2 months to transport African people from Africa? Or is it more plausible that they transported the Moors from Europe and dropped them off in North and South America, only 10 days away? The people who were put on ships and brought to North America by white people were not from Africa. They were from Europe. They were captives of war, and they belonged to the black nobility who ruled all of Europe. And I just want to show you guys some of the documents showing the white races of Europe. And we can get a better perspective as to who the Moors were fighting. These are the albinos and the beasts of Europe. And the Moors were fighting these people for hundreds of years prior to the so-called transatlantic slave trade. And one interesting thing I wanted to show you is that when you look at these beasts and albinos and how they have achieved what they've been able to achieve in just a few hundred years, keeping in mind that they were considered wild men just a few hundred years ago, and they had no last names. Many of them didn't even have first names. And I wanted to show you this because I found this very interesting. If you see here the wild men, and you look at the clothing that the people are wearing to the left, you can see here they're wearing this clothing to cover up their hairy bodies. So I found that very interesting. And something else I found in the British Library was one of the oldest genealogy charts, one of the first ones made for white people. And as you can see at the bottom of that genealogy chart, you see 2 wild men. So they're showing that their ancestry comes from the caveman. So that should give you something to think about, considering that just a few hundred years later, today, we have people like the Queen of England who claim to be of the royal bloodline of Egyptians and Cushites who ruled the earth. They even found the remains of a boy who was buried at Stonehenge in Europe. He was buried in Europe, but he actually came from the Mediterranean Sea in Africa. And he came to Europe 3,500 years ago. So that's in 1500 BC. So we're told that the Moors arrived in Europe in 700 AD. But here we have Black people out of Africa coming to Europe over 2,000 years before the Moors arrived in 700 AD. And we know who arrived in Europe long before 700 AD, Akhenaten's daughter. So the last thing that I want to talk to you about is the slave names. So I'm going to use the name Wright as an example. So Black people with the last name Wright can be found in North America, Canada, and in Jamaica. So the question is, did all of these Black people from Jamaica, North America, and Canada have the same slave master with the same last name, Wright? And the answer is no. The last name Wright is one of the oldest names that can be found in Britain and in Scotland. Some records say that the name Wright comes from Britain, dating to 700 AD, at the very same time that the Moors came to Europe. British sources say the name Wright means worker, as in cartwright, shipwright, wheelwright, etc. In actuality, the name Wright comes from ancient Scotland, long before 700 AD. It means son of the right, or son of the righteous. So study your last name. If your last name can be traced to Britain, Ireland, Scotland, and other parts of Europe, and your name predates the time that white people ruled Europe, it means that you belong to the Black nobility of Europe. And your ancestors were not brought from Africa on slave ships and given slave names by the white man, but they were in fact brought from Europe. And this is why it's no coincidence that the only time in history that we see white people gathering Black people and putting them in boats is during the time that white people were expelling the Moors from Europe.
Try not to cry, y'all. That's why this is so important.
So the term Black Dutch is a term that was used in historical documents from 1600 to the 1900s, and the term Black Dutch was used to refer to several groups of people, and the term was used in census records, church records, and even old newspaper articles. Some of the groups include Black people of New York, who came from the Netherlands. The Cherokee Indians of North Carolina also identified themselves as the Black Dutch. Many Jews, known as Sephardic Jews, had babies with Africans in America. Their mixed children were also called the Black Dutch. So what does it mean to be Dutch? Dutch is a term used by the Germans, who they themselves call themselves the Dutch people. So a Black Dutch is a Black German or a Black European. And the Black Dutch were actually from Germany, but also mainly from Ireland. Keep in mind that Moor means black. So to say Black Dutch would be like saying a Moor who was a Dutch. And we know that the Moors ruled all of Germany and the rest of all of Europe. So the Black Dutch are Moors from Germany and Ireland, and they are recorded as being in America starting in 1618. Now the time frame of 1618 is very important because we see what was happening in Germany from 1618 to 1648. And it explains why the Moors of Europe, or the Black Dutch, were leaving Germany in the first place. From 1618 to 1648, albinos and beasts of Germany were fighting the Moors of Germany and Ireland. In fact, we can look at what was going on in the 1400s, 200 years before the 1600s. The Moors were already fighting the cave beasts in Germany. And we can see that by this tapestry that is found in Germany, which shows the Moors fighting the Neanderthals. So 200 years later, in 1618, the Moors had been fighting the cave beasts for 200 years at this point, at least. And the year 1618 marked the beginning of a 30-year war that broke out between the Moors who ruled all of Europe and the albinos and beasts who were trying to set themselves up as kings and queens of Europe. So although we know the Moors and the cave beasts had many battles for many generations, this particular battle in 1618 is so important because in 1619, this is when we're told the first slave ship arrives to America. And this is 1 year after the war begins with the Moors and the cave beasts. So it's like I said in part 1, the African people who were brought to the Americas in ships were not from Africa, although we know that all African people originate in Africa, but these people were not from Africa or brought from Africa. They were brought from Europe. They were the Black nobility of Europe, the original kings and queens, before the Neanderthals. And the Christian Crusades were nothing more than a series of battles that took place between the Neanderthals and the Moors. And Neanderthals weren't going around evangelizing the world. They were going around all of Europe, then later the Americas, and killing the Moors and the native people. And the cross is not a Christian symbol. It was worn by the Moors first. You see, the Muslims call it the Muslim Crusades, and it was the Muslims who had crosses that had Arabic inscriptions from the Quran. So it wasn't white Christians going around bearing the image of the cross. It was the Moors who had this image first. In fact, before the Moors were fighting the cave beast in Europe, the symbol of the cross can be found in Egypt. So Black people have a very distorted view of what slavery was, or the so-called slave trade. Nevertheless, it's no coincidence that the first year that we see the census records in 1618 showing us that the Moors were in America, this is the very same year that the 30-year war started between the Moors and the cave beasts in 1618. And that just so happens to be the very same time frame that slave ships start showing up in the Americas. And when you look closely, you can clearly see that these people were Moors. And another thing is that many people aren't aware of the fact that white people were being sold as slaves in America in the 1800s. So that's 200 years after the Moors were recorded in the census in America in 1618. 200 years later, white people were still being sold as slaves in the 1800s. And more importantly, the issue of white slavery is something rarely discussed. But the enslavement of the white race has been going on since ancient Egypt. And even in the ancient Americas, even all the way back to the flood of Gilgamesh. And white people were still being sold as slaves just 200 years ago in America in the 1800s. So it makes you wonder just how much of the story has really been left out by white people. And I read this article a few months ago, and it was about this white family in America, and they had done some DNA testing trying to figure out what part of Europe they came from. And this family believed that they were pure European. And when they did the DNA test, the results came back that 2-3 generations back, they had black ancestors. So it was interesting to this white family to find out that 2-3 generations ago, they had a black grandfather. And it was interesting because it caused me to look at some other studies. And there are many genetic studies out there that have proven that half of the white people in America, and I'm just roughly guesstimating by saying half, I think it's more like 35%, but roughly half of white people in America have 2 and 3 generations back a black ancestor. And we know that 2-3 generations back, this is when the so-called slave trade was going on. This is when white people came to the Americas. And it's important to know one thing about white people is that half of white people in America came during the first wave. Okay, so half of the white population of America came as the first white settlers. The other half of the white population in America came in the mid-1900s, immigrating from other European countries and settling in America. But it's important to know that that first wave of white people that came to the Americas, they have black blood in their veins to this day. And if you research the first white people who came to America, you will see that the majority of them were married to Moors. So how did the first white settlers really get here? Because once you realize that the Moors were in America in the 1600s, white people who were coming to America during this time were married to the Moors. And almost half of white people in America have black blood running through their veins from 2 and 3 generations back, proving that they mingled with the Moors. And white people were being sold as slaves in the 1800s. In fact, white people in Kansas in the 1800s were fighting for squatter sovereignty, and they were trying to abolish white slavery. It really makes you rethink how the first white people actually got here in the first place. And we really have to start really deeply thinking about something. Why do white people teach us that we were their slaves, that we were their servants, and not one mention in any history book about the real truth that white people were the slaves to the Egyptians and the Cushites of the world on every continent, long before these cave beasts set themselves up as kings. They were, for thousands of years, the servants of the Egyptians and the Cushites. And we civilized them. We taught them. We taught them everything. We clothed them. We taught them how to speak, how to read, how to write, and we helped them evolve from the beast that they were to modern man. And they repay us by going around the world trying to erase every ounce of our existence, trying to erase every shred of evidence that proves that black people were the original rulers and founders of the earth long before the Neanderthal.
He then urged these people to enter his ship for salvation. Those who entered soon found they were barred from leaving. As the ship sailed, they were sold to Hawkins' fellow slave merchants in the West Indies. Now it's important to highlight that the 700-ton ship was purchased by King Henry VIII. And 20 years later, it was Queen Elizabeth who led the ship to Hawkins, effectively sanctioning the slave trade in humans and showing that the English involvement in the slave trade was sanctioned at the highest level. Moreover, Hawkins had a reputation for being a religious man. Who required his crew to serve God daily. And to love one another. Services were even held on board twice a day. Despite the imprisonment and detainment of so-called Africans against their will, restrained by fear and shackles. Being cousins, Sir Francis Drake accompanied Hawkins on his 1562 voyage and others. Drake was claimed to be devoutly religious as well. Between 1562 and 1567, Hawkins and his cousin Francis Drake made 3 voyages to Guinea and Sierra Leone and enslaved between 1200 and 1400 so-called Africans. Mind you, these men, women, and children would have contained some of the brightest, fittest, and strongest the 2 states would have needed to develop and become mighty. A loss accounting for one of the steep costs the continent of Africa has suffered, not to talk of the death of those who viciously fought back, those who got drowned while escaping, and those who simply were beaten or clobbered to death.